Hello everyone and welcome to my Y&R Trends channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Her room held the quiet, almost sacred stillness of a place that had learned to absorb shock without echoing it back. For Billy Abbott, the air itself seemed to have thickened, turning to syrup in his lungs, making each breath a conscious, laborious effort. He stared at the letter in his hands, the crisp, official paper feeling alien and cold against his skin. It was just a document, a collection of typed words and printed numbers, yet it possessed the cataclysmic power to dismantle the very foundation upon which he had built the last several years of his life. The words probability of paternity, 99.99%, weren't merely a statistical conclusion, they were a seismic charge detonating directly under his feet, shattering the bedrock of his identity as a father, his understanding of his past, and his complicated, often painful, history with the man whose name was listed alongside his own. Victor Newman. The name alone was a force of nature in Genoa City, synonymous with power, control, and a legacy of conflict that had defined the Abbott family for generations. To Billy, Victor was a nemesis, a monolithic figure whose shadow he had fought to escape his entire adult life. He was the man who had challenged him, bested him, and in Billy's eyes, represented everything he sought to rebel against. The idea that their bloodlines, those two fiercely oppositional rivers, could have converged, could have mingled to create a life, was not just improbable, it was a fundamental violation of the natural order of his world. This wasn't a simple plot twist, it was an unraveling of his entire narrative, a cruel joke played by the universe that left him feeling untethered, a ghost in his own skin, staring at a past he never knew was his. His first reaction was a cold, numbing denial that spread from his core to the very tips of his fingers, leaving them tingling and useless. He let the paper fall to the desk, the soft rustle deafening in the silence. "No!" he whispered to the empty room. The word a feeble shield against an undeniable truth. There had to be a mistake, a contamination of the sample, a clerical error of epic proportions. This was the kind of dramatic, life-altering chaos that happened to other people, the stuff of sensational headlines and overwrought television dramas, not the grounded, albeit messy reality of Billy Abbott. He mentally retraced his steps, the timeline, the fleeting, tumultuous encounters with Victoria, Victor's daughter, during that specific period. It was a time blurred by his own personal struggles, a haze of poor decisions and emotional turmoil, but even through that fog, the math was terrifyingly, incontrovertibly correct. The date of conception aligned with a brief, passionate reconciliation with Victoria, a moment of weakness and longing that had ultimately led to another heartbreak, but never, not in his wildest imaginings, to this. The denial began to curdle, transforming into a rising tide of panic, a frantic, animalistic need to escape the four walls that were now closing in on him, suffocating him with their new horrifying truth. His mind, reeling from the initial shock, began to connect 1,000 disparate dots, and with each connection, a new wave of vertigo washed over him. Memories, once viewed through a straightforward lens of rivalry and resentment, now took on a sinister, double-exposed quality. He thought of Victor's relentless interest in his life, his manipulations, his sometimes inexplicable actions that went beyond mere business enmity. Had there been a flicker of something else in the old man's steely gaze all those times? A paternal curiosity masquerading as disdain? Or was that just his mind, now poisoned with this new knowledge, rewriting history to fit the brutal facts? He thought of his own son Johnny, the boy he had raised and loved with every fiber of his being. The fierce protective love he felt for the child was the one pure, unwavering constant in his life. And now the very essence of that relationship felt called into question, not in his heart, but in the cold, hard language of biology and legacy. Was his love for Johnny any less real? Of course not. But the context had been violently shifted, and he felt a profound and terrifying sense of dislocation, as if he had been playing a role his entire life without ever knowing the true script. The need to confront the source, to see the truth reflected in the eyes of the man who had, unknowingly, been his father all this time, became an unbearable physical ache, a magnetic pull he lacked the strength or will to resist. He didn't remember deciding to leave his apartment. His body seemed to move on its own volition, a vessel carrying a churning storm of confusion and dread. The drive to the Newman Enterprises building was a blur of traffic lights and anonymous faces. The world outside the car window continuing its mundane routine, utterly oblivious to the cataclysm happening within him. He parked haphazardly, barely turning off the ignition, and strode through the polished, intimidating lobby, past the receptionist who recognized him and knew better than to stop an abbot on a mission. The elevator ride to the executive floor was an eternity, his own pale, haunted reflection staring back at him from the brass doors. He was walking into the lion's den, not as a business rival, not as a nuisance, but as what? A son? The word was so foreign, so ludicrous in this context, that it almost made him laugh, a hollow, desperate sound that died in his throat. He didn't knock. He pushed the heavy mahogany door to Victor's office open, the action fueled by a raw, untamed energy that had been building inside him since he first read the damning words. The office was as imposing as ever, a testament to Victor's power and taste, all dark wood, rich leather, and a wall of windows overlooking the city he commanded. Victor was seated behind his massive desk, studying a financial report, and he looked up, his expression initially one of mild, annoyed interruption, the familiar impatience he reserved for Billy. "Billy," he began, his voice a low rumble of authority. "Whatever this is about, I don't have the time." But he stopped mid-sentence. Something in Billy's face, in the wild, lost look in his eyes, the way his entire body seemed to vibrate with a tension that was more than just anger, gave the older man pause. Victor Newman was a master of reading people, of sensing weakness and opportunity, and what he saw in Billy at that moment was neither. It was something far more primal. Billy didn't speak. He couldn't. The words were trapped in the maelstrom of his emotions, tangled in a knot of anger, fear, and a desperate, humiliating need for answers. He simply walked forward, his steps unsteady, and with a hand that trembled violently, he slammed the folded DNA results onto the polished surface of Victor's desk. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Victor's eyes narrowed, his gaze dropping from Billy's shattered face to the paper. He reached for it with a deliberate slowness, his movements controlled and measured, a stark contrast to Billy's frantic disarray. He unfolded it, and as his eyes scanned the page, a profound silence descended upon the room. It was a silence so heavy and deep it seemed to absorb all sound, all light, leaving only the two of them suspended in this impossible moment. Billy watched him, his own breath held, searching for any flicker of reaction in that famously inscrutable face. He saw the slight tightening around Victor's mouth, the almost imperceptible widening of his eyes, a minute tremor in the hand that held the paper. It was not the shock of a man completely blindsided, but the grim, sobering acceptance of a truth he had perhaps, on some subconscious level, always suspected. Victor slowly lowered the paper, placing it back on the desk with a quiet finality. He looked up at Billy, and the dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted. The air was no longer charged with simple animosity. It was now thick with the weight of a shared, shocking history. "Where did you get this?" Victor asked, his voice softer than before, stripped of its usual commanding edge. It was the tone of a man confronting a reality that could not be bullied or bought. The question so simple broke the dam inside Billy. The anger he had been clinging to as a life raft suddenly dissolved, and what surged up in its place was a raw, unadulterated wave of grief and confusion. The tears came then, not a gentle welling but a torrent he was powerless to stop. They were tears for the lost years, for the twisted path of his life, for the little boy who had grown up without a father only to find him in the last place he would ever look. They were tears of relief and terror, of a profound loss and a bewildering gain, all crashing together in a soul-shattering crescendo. "All this time," Billy choked out, his voice ragged and broken, barely a whisper. "All this time we hated each other, we fought. And you were—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The words "my father" were still too monstrous, too impossible to speak aloud. His body sagged, the fight gone out of him, leaving only a profound and weary vulnerability. He was no longer Billy Abbott, the rebellious scion, the thorn in Victor's side. He was just a lost boy, standing before the man who had given him life, and the decades of loneliness, of searching for a place to belong, of subconsciously seeking approval from this very man, culminated in this single devastating moment of collapse. Victor rose from his chair. He moved around the desk, his movements uncharacteristically slow and deliberate, no longer the predatory stride of a corporate titan, but the cautious approach of a man navigating an emotional minefield. He stopped a few feet from Billy, his own expression a complex tapestry of emotions, shock, a dawning realization, and beneath it all, a flicker of something that looked astonishingly like regret. He saw not his rival, but his son, utterly broken by a truth that was as shocking to him as it was to the younger man. For a long moment, he simply looked at Billy, taking in the shuddering shoulders, the tear-streaked face, the raw anguish. Then, in a gesture that was as unlikely as the revelation itself, Victor Newman, the man who commanded empires and inspired fear, opened his arms. It was not a grand dramatic gesture, but a simple quiet offering. And Billy, with the last of his defenses utterly annihilated, fell into them. He buried his face in Victor's shoulder, his body racked with sobs that seemed to tear him apart from the inside. He clung to the man, his father, as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had just been turned inside out. And Victor held him. His embrace was firm, steady, an anchor in the storm. He didn't speak platitudes or offer empty assurances. He simply held his son, allowing the tempest of emotion to rage, absorbing the shock and the pain through the simple, powerful act of presence. In that silent, world-altering embrace, decades of rivalry, bitterness, and conflict were not erased. They were too deeply etched into the fabric of their lives for that, but they were suddenly, irrevocably recontextualized. Every barbed comment, every business takeover, every moment of seething resentment now existed in the shadow of this new staggering truth. The hug was a beginning and an end. It was the closing of one long, painful chapter and the terrifying, uncertain opening of another. It was a surrender to a fate neither had chosen, but which they would now forever be bound to share. The air in the room, once thick with tension, now hummed with the silent, seismic aftershocks of a history rewritten, a future unimaginable, and a bond, however fractured and complex, that had finally, after a lifetime, been acknowledged. The air in the Newman Ranch study was unusually still that afternoon, as if the room itself sensed something seismic was about to happen. Billy Abbott stood near the large window, the late sunlight cutting through the heavy curtains and slicing across his face in uneven patches of golden shadow. His hands were trembling, though he tried to hide it by shoving them into his pockets. He had come here with a mix of anger, confusion, and disbelief, but mostly with questions he wasn't ready to ask. Across the room, Victor Newman stood behind his mahogany desk, his posture as firm and unyielding as ever, though his eyes betrayed something softer, something almost foreign for a man who'd built his reputation on power and control. For years, the two men had been rivals, enemies even, trading barbs, waging business wars, and sabotaging each other's lives whenever the opportunity arose. They were opposites in almost every way. Victor, the legendary patriarch who demanded loyalty and respect. Billy, the reckless son of the Abbott family, forever shadowed by his own mistakes and desperate to prove himself. Yet in that moment, both of them were stripped of titles and reputations. What lay between them was not business or pride, but something raw, something deeply personal. Billy had found the DNA test results only an hour earlier. It had been meant to settle an old rumor, a whisper that had floated around Genoa City for decades, and was always dismissed as absurd gossip. But curiosity and a gnawing sense of unease had driven Billy to test it for himself, never expecting the result that flashed across the screen of his phone. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. He had stared at it for a full 5 minutes, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then, like a man possessed, he drove straight to Victor's estate, ignoring every instinct telling him to stay away. Now, standing in the same room with the man who had been his greatest adversary, Billy felt the world tilt beneath him. His throat tightened and he could barely force the words out. "Tell me it's not true," he said, his voice cracking despite the effort to sound composed. "Tell me this test is some kind of mistake." Victor's gaze didn't waver. "You've seen the results yourself," he replied, his tone low, measured. "There's no mistake, Billy. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I wasn't sure you could handle it." Billy let out a shaky laugh, the kind that comes when a man is trying not to fall apart. "Handle it? You've been my worst nightmare for years, Victor. You've destroyed deals, sabotaged my company, humiliated me every chance you got. And now you're telling me you're my father." His voice rose, fueled by disbelief and anger. What kind of twisted joke is this? Victor stepped forward slowly, the weight of his words pressing into every stride. It's not a joke, he said firmly. I didn't know when you were born. Your mother. He hesitated, the rare crack in his composure visible for just a second. She never told me. By the time I found out, it was too late to undo the damage that had already been done. Billy shook his head, pacing the room like a caged animal. No, this doesn't make sense. You hated me. You treated me like trash. You went out of your way to ruin me every chance you got. I treated you like I treat anyone who challenges me, Victor countered, his voice growing stronger. Because I didn't know. But now I do, and that changes everything. Billy froze mid-step. Changes everything? He repeated bitterly. Do you really think you can erase years of hell with one DNA test? His voice dropped to a whisper. Do you even understand what this means to me? Victor's eyes softened just a fraction. It means you're part of this family, he said quietly. You're my son. For a long moment the words just hung there, heavy and impossible. Billy felt his knees weaken, his mind spinning with images of the past. Every argument, every insult, every painful comparison between him and Nick, Adam or Victoria. He'd always felt like an outsider. But now he realized that blood connected him to the very man he despised most. It was cruel irony. I don't want to be a Newman, Billy finally said, his voice breaking. I don't want your money, your name, or your empire. I'm not offering you those things, Victor replied. I'm offering you the truth. The silence stretched between them again, so thick it was almost suffocating. Billy turned away, staring out the window as tears welled in his eyes despite his desperate attempts to hold them back. He thought of his mother, Jill, who had always danced around questions about his father. He thought of Jack, his brother, who had stood by him through every failure. And now this revelation made him feel like a stranger in his own family. Does Jack know? He asked suddenly without turning around. Victor hesitated. Not yet. Billy closed his eyes. God, when he finds out. His voice cracked completely then, and his chest tightened until he could hardly breathe. All the anger, confusion, and pain inside him seemed to shatter at once. He spun around, tears streaming down his face. Why now, Victor? Why tell me now after everything? Victor's expression hardened slightly, though the sadness in his eyes remained. Because you deserve to know the truth, he said. And because I couldn't keep lying to myself. Something broke inside Billy then. A lifetime of resentment and rivalry collapsing under the weight of one truth. Before he could stop himself, he took a step forward, then another, until he stood right in front of Victor. His lip trembled, and for the first time in years, the walls he'd built came crashing down. Without warning, he lunged forward and wrapped his arms around the man he'd once sworn to destroy. Victor stood frozen for a heartbeat, then placed a firm hand on Billy's back, his grip both hesitant and protective. Neither spoke. The only sound was Billy's quiet sobs echoing softly in the vast room. In that embrace, years of hatred dissolved, at least for the moment, and two men who had never known how to understand each other finally shared something real. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first step toward something new, something that neither of them had ever expected. Family. Victor thought of the times he had dismissed Billy as weak, unstable, a disappointment compared to his own children. Had he been measuring him against a standard he himself had failed to provide the foundation for? The irony was a bitter pill, one that settled heavily in his gut. He saw with a clarity that was almost painful, the ghost of his own youthful defiance in Billy's posture, the same stubborn set of the jaw that he himself had possessed decades ago. He had spent years seeing a watered-down version of John Abbott in the boy, but now, he could see glimpses of himself, the raw, untamed ambition, the capacity for self-destruction, the deep, unquenchable need for validation. It was like looking into a distorted, fragmented mirror of his own past. We need to talk, Victor said finally, his voice low and devoid of its usual commanding edge. It was a statement of fact, not a demand. He moved back towards his desk, not to reclaim his position of power, but to pull out a heavy, leather-bound chair, gesturing for Billy to sit. He then poured 2 glasses of water from a crystal decanter, pushing one across the desk in a gesture that was startlingly mundane, a simple human act of care in a situation that was anything but. Billy stared at the glass, the condensation beating on its surface, as if it were the most complex object he had ever seen. He finally sank into the offered chair, the fight and the flight both having drained completely out of him, leaving a numb, weary confusion in their wake. He took a sip of the water, the cool liquid a minor shock to his system, helping to ground him in the present moment.